No smoke was rising from her chimney. Not a thin curl, not a whisper. Nothing. For 3 hours before dawn, the fire in that small prairie house had been out completely, the stove cold enough to touch, the ash gray and dead in the grate. Any neighbor passing on the frozen road that morning would have assumed the worst. A woman alone. A child alone with her. No fire, no smoke. They would have been wrong. Behind a wall of heavy fabric, drawn tight around the bed like something out of an old country nobody in that county had ever seen, a woman and a boy were sleeping warm enough to sweat under their blankets. Just a few miles away, in houses with fires still burning, families were waking up to frost on the inside of their windows. Nobody could explain it. Not at first. Some called it foolishness. Some called it something worse. But before that winter ended, it was not her door people were laughing at anymore. It was theirs. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like this survive because people still remember them. And if frontier wisdom like this matters to you, stick around, because we are just getting to the part where it almost did not work at all. 3 months earlier, the house had still smelled like him. Eric Solberg had been a careful man, the kind who split more wood than he needed because he did not trust a mild autumn to stay mild. He checked the roof before the rain checked it for him. He counted the flour sacks twice. His wife, Aylin, used to tease him about it, the way he walked the property each evening like he was reading it, like the land had something to say if a person paid close enough attention. He was thrown from the wagon in October, somewhere between the grain mill and home, on a stretch of road that had never given anyone trouble before. By the time a neighbor found the horse standing riderless at the fence line, there was nothing left to do but bring him home. Aylin buried her husband 3 weeks before the first hard frost. She did not have time to grieve the way grief is supposed to happen, slowly, in private, at its own pace. The ground was already hardening. The days were already shortening. And a boy of 7, her son Christian, was still waking every morning expecting his father's boots by the door. For a while, neighbors came. Mrs. Thorvald brought soup twice that first week. Gunnar, who ran cattle on the land bordering hers, sent his hired hand over to help finish stacking what wood Eric had already cut before the accident. It was decent of them. Nobody in that county would have called it otherwise. But decency has a season, same as everything else on the prairie. By the time the first snow came, the visits had thinned to almost nothing. People had their own households to keep warm, their own children to feed. A widow managing on her own was a sad fact of frontier life, not a project anyone had the fuel to take on for an entire winter. Aylin understood this. She did not resent it, not exactly. What she felt instead was something colder and more practical. The slow, sinking arithmetic of a woman counting what she had left and measuring it against what the season was about to demand. At night, after Christian was asleep, she would sit by the stove with her husband's ledger open on her knees, not because the numbers in it still mattered, but because his handwriting was still in it. And for a few minutes, each evening, that was enough to make the house feel less empty. She did not yet know that the real crisis was not grief. It was wood. And wood, unlike grief, would not wait for her to be ready. By the second week of November, Aylin had stopped avoiding the question and started answering it with a measuring stick. She walked out to the woodpile on a gray morning, the kind where the sky presses low enough to touch, and she counted. Not roughly, properly, row by row, the way Eric used to, though she had never once done it herself while he was alive. There had never been a reason to. He simply made sure there was enough, the same quiet way he made sure the well did not run dry. The count came to just under 9 cords. She sat with that number for a long moment, before she let herself do the second part of the math. How many cords a house their size typically burned across a full Dakota winter, from the first hard frost through the final thaw? Neighbors had mentioned figures before, in passing, the kind of thing men said to each other while loading wagons. Something between 14 and 18 cords, depending on how brutal the season turned and how tightly a house held its heat. 9 was not close to 14. 9 was barely enough to reach February, and February in that part of the territory was rarely where winter ended. It was often where it deepened. Christian's cough started around the same time, a small dry sound in the back of his throat that she told herself was nothing, the kind of thing children picked up when the weather turned. But it did not go away. It came back every evening after the fire had burned low and the house had cooled enough for their breath to show faintly in the lamplight. She began keeping him closer to the stove during the day. She began waking twice a night instead of once, not for the fire exactly, but to listen, to make sure the small sound of his breathing was still steady. The problem was not only the wood running short, it was what running short would force her to choose between. Keep the fire fed generously through the coldest stretch and risk running out entirely before spring. Or ration the fire now, burn conservatively, and risk a child with a weak chest sleeping in a house that never quite got warm enough to matter. Neither option felt survivable. Both were, technically, the only options she had. She did not sleep much that night. She sat by the ledger again, not reading it this time, just holding it, the way a person holds on to something steady when the ground underneath them has started to feel less certain than it used to. Somewhere in that stretch of sleeplessness, an old memory began working its way back to the surface. Not an answer yet, just a shape, half-formed, from a country she had left as a girl. The memory arrived the way old memories often do, uninvited, arriving sideways instead of head-on. Elin was thinking about wood, about chords and calculations, when what surfaced instead was a smell, wool, slightly damp, slightly like wood smoke, the particular scent of her grandmother's house in Trøndelag, a house Elin had not stood inside of in over 20 years. She had been perhaps 5 or 6 the last winter she spent there, before her family made the crossing to America. What she remembered most clearly was not the cold outside. It was the bed. Her grandmother's bed had not been a bed the way Elin thought of beds now, an open frame in an open room. It had been built into the wall itself, a wooden alcove with heavy curtains that drew shut on iron rings, sealing the sleeper inside a small, dark, close space no larger than a narrow closet. Her grandmother called it a lukaseng, a closed bed. As a child, Elin had found it strange, even a little frightening, the idea of sleeping enclosed like that, curtains pulled tight around her on every side. But she remembered, too, how warm it had been inside. Warmer than the room. Warmer, some nights, than seemed possible, given how little fire the house kept burning once the family had gone to sleep. She remembered her grandmother explaining it once, in the practical, unsentimental way older women in that country explained most things. "The house is cold," the old woman had said. "But you are not the house. Close the small space around your own body, and you only have to warm a small space, not the whole night, not the whole room, just you." At the time, it had seemed like a strange, old-fashioned habit, the kind of thing people did before they knew better. Sitting in her Dakota kitchen decades later, with 9 cords of wood standing between her family and a Dakota winter, it no longer seemed old-fashioned. It seemed like the only arithmetic that might actually close. She did not act on it immediately. The idea felt almost embarrassing once she said it aloud to herself, sewing curtains around a bed while men in this county split wood with their bare hands through blizzards. It felt small. It felt like something a frightened woman did instead of solving the real problem. But she kept turning it over anyway, the way a person turns over an idea they have already half decided to try, looking for reasons it might fail before they commit to finding out. The fabric was the first problem, and it was not a small one. Ellen owned wool, not a great deal of it, but enough, set aside carefully over the past year for the winter clothing Christian would need as he kept growing out of last year's coat. It was meant to become sleeves, a collar, a lining sewn inside a jacket too thin on its own to survive January. Using that wool for curtains meant a boy without a warm coat, betting instead on an idea she was not even certain would work, remembered secondhand from a childhood she had spent more time forgetting than preserving. She stood in front of the fabric for a long time before she picked up the shears. What convinced her, in the end, was not confidence. It was the cough. Christian had not slept a full night without waking in almost 2 weeks, and each morning he seemed a little more tired than the one before, the kind of tiredness that worried her more than the coughing itself. A coat solved one kind of cold. It did nothing for the hours he spent asleep in a room that dropped well below comfortable once the fire burned down toward morning. If the closed bed worked even partway, it addressed the danger that mattered most, the long stretch of night when nobody was awake to feed the stove or notice a child struggling to stay warm. She began sewing that evening, cutting the heavy wool into wide panels, working by lamplight after Christian had gone to sleep, so he would not ask questions she did not yet have good answers for. The frame came next, simple wooden rails mounted around 3 sides of the bed, close enough to the walls that the curtains, once hung, would seal the sleeping space almost completely. She used what lumber scraps remained from Eric's woodpile, the irony of it not lost on her, building warmth from what was left of the man who used to keep the family warm, a different way. It took 4 evenings to finish. When she finally drew the curtains shut around the empty bed and stepped back to look at it, the whole arrangement struck her as faintly absurd. A wall of wool fabric where a proper bedroom should be. She almost laughed. Then she thought of the cough, and she did not. That night, she and Christian slept behind the curtains for the first time. Gunnar noticed the curtains before Aylin had a chance to explain them. He had come by on a Tuesday with a sack of cornmeal his wife insisted the widow could use, the kind of errand that gave a man a respectable reason to check on a household without making the checking obvious. He was not an unkind person. In a county where most families were one bad season from real trouble, Gunnar had a reputation for showing up quietly when it mattered and saying little about it afterward. He set the cornmeal on the table, glanced toward the bedroom doorway, and stopped. The heavy wool hung floor to ceiling around the bed frame, drawn back that morning but unmistakable, an arrangement he had never once seen in any house on that prairie. He asked about it plainly, the way a practical man asks about anything unfamiliar, not to embarrass but to understand. Aylin explained it as simply as she could. The wool held in body heat overnight. It meant less wood burned keeping the whole house warm, since only the small enclosed space needed to stay comfortable. Gunnar listened, and his doubt, when it came, was not cruel. It was considered. "Cloth is not a wall," he said. "It does not stop wind the way timber does, and if the fire goes out overnight in weather like this county sees in January, fabric alone will not be enough to keep a child from real danger." He had seen frost form inside houses with far sturdier construction than a curtain rail. He said this not to frighten her, but because he had buried a neighbor's infant 2 winters back, in a house everyone had assumed was adequately built. He asked gently, whether she had considered simply asking around for help with wood instead. Pride was an understandable thing, he said, but pride did not keep a boy's lungs warm at night. Elin did not have a confident answer for him. She only had the 2 nights already behind her, nights during which the fire had burned low by midnight and the room outside the curtains had turned properly cold, and yet Christian had slept without waking, without coughing, warm enough that she had found herself checking on him more from habit than from worry. She told Gunnar this. He did not look convinced, but he did not argue further either. He said only that he hoped she was right, and that if the wood ran low regardless, he would rather know about it than have her manage alone out of stubbornness. It was not mockery, not from him, but word travels on a prairie the way frost travels across a window, quietly, into every corner. By the following week, Thorvald had heard about the widow sewing curtains around her bed instead of chopping wood like everyone else, and the story had already begun losing its careful details on the way from one kitchen to another. The first real test came on a night colder than either of the 2 before it, and it was the night the system nearly failed. Elin had grown confident, perhaps too confident, in the 2 mild successes already behind her. She banked the fire, as usual, drew the curtains shut around herself and Christian, and settled in expecting the same steady warmth that had held through the earlier nights. She woke sometime after midnight to Christian shifting restlessly beside her, his small body curled tight, his breath coming in short, uneven pulls. When she reached for him, his feet were cold. Not cool. Cold, in a way that made her sit up immediately and press her palm flat against the wool curtain nearest the floor. There it was, a thin, steady draft, barely perceptible unless a person searched for it directly, slipping in along the gap where the curtain hem fell just short of the floorboards. It had not mattered on milder nights. Tonight, with the outside temperature dropping harder and faster than the 2 nights before, that narrow gap had been enough to let the cold work its way in along the floor, pooling invisibly at the exact level where a sleeping child's feet would find it first. She spent the rest of that night with Christian pulled up close against her. Extra blankets wrapped around his feet, listening to his breathing until it evened out again sometime near dawn. He was tired and pale the next morning, but no worse than tired and pale. It had not become anything dangerous. It could have. Elin understood that clearly, sitting at the table afterward with her hands still faintly unsteady. The idea itself was not wrong. Her grandmother's memory had not failed her, but a memory built for a different house, a different climate, a different set of walls, had arrived in Dakota missing a detail that mattered enormously here, in a county where the ground itself seemed to breathe cold up through the floorboards once the temperature dropped hard enough. She had trusted the shape of the idea without yet understanding all the ways this particular house could defeat it. That gap near the floor was going to have to close. She did not yet know exactly how. It was Björn who showed her, though it took her 2 more days to understand what she was seeing. The dog had taken to sleeping just outside the curtained bed, rather than in his usual spot near the stove, which struck Elin as strange until she noticed where, specifically, he chose to lie each night. Not simply near the bed, always along the same stretch of floor, a narrow strip running the length of the frame's base, shifting position slightly from night to night, but never straying from that same low line. She watched him for a 3rd evening, and this time she got down onto the floor herself, at Björn's level, and held her hand flat against the boards along that same stretch. The draft was there, fainter than the night Christian had gone cold, but unmistakable once she was searching for it correctly. A thin current of outside air working its way up through a gap where the cabin's floor met the exterior wall, then traveling along the floorboards until it reached the coldest, lowest point in the room, which happened to be exactly where the curtain's hem fell short. Björn was not choosing that spot out of loyalty. He was choosing it because, low to the ground the way dogs are, he could feel a current of moving air that Elin, standing upright most of the day, had never been positioned to notice. She began testing the rest of the room the same way, palm flat against the floor, moving along each wall. She found 2 smaller gaps elsewhere, minor by comparison, but the one beneath the curtained bed remained the worst by a considerable margin. The fix, once she understood the actual problem, was not complicated. She sewed a heavier-weighted hem along the base of each curtain panel, using scraps of leather and stone-filled pouches sewn directly into the fabric to hold the bottom edge firmly against the floorboards, sealing the gap the wind had been using. She also moved the bed frame itself, shifting it roughly a foot away from the exterior wall, putting distance between the sleeping space and the coldest surface in the house. It was a small correction. It made a considerable difference. The true first test came on a night in early December, ordinary by that winter's later standards, but cold enough to matter. The kind of night that would have demanded a fire fed steadily until morning in any other house on that stretch of prairie. Elin fed the stove as usual before bed, banked the coals, and drew the weighted curtains shut around herself and Christian. This time, she did not wake at midnight from cold feet or restless shifting. She woke naturally, near dawn, to the ordinary sound of a boy already stirring beside her, warm, breathing easily, in no hurry to leave the closed bed's warmth for the cooler room beyond the curtains. When she finally checked the stove, the fire had burned out completely sometime well before sunrise. The room beyond the curtains was properly cold, cold enough that her own breath showed faintly the moment she stepped outside the fabric walls. She counted the wood that morning out of habit more than necessity, and found she had used roughly half what a night like that would ordinarily have required, based on what she remembered burning during comparable cold snaps the previous winter, when Eric still fed the stove generously through each night to keep the whole house warm. It was not proof of everything yet. One cold night, successfully managed, was not the same as an entire Dakota winter, but it was the first solid evidence that the idea her grandmother had carried across an ocean, and that Elin had nearly dismissed as an old woman's habit, was doing exactly what it had always been meant to do. Word of that particular morning reached Mrs. Thorvald within the week, the way most things eventually reached Mrs. Thorvald, and this time the story arrived with a detail attached that made her pause over her own dwindling woodpile a little longer than she otherwise might have. She did not say anything to Elin directly. Not yet. But she found an excuse to walk past the Solberg property twice that week, slower than the errand required, looking toward the chimney each time to see whether smoke was rising. It rarely was, by morning, and somehow, the house never seemed any worse for it. The storm announced itself 3 days before it arrived, in the way prairie storms often did for anyone who knew how to read the signs. The wind shifted out of the northwest and stayed there. The livestock grew restless in the evenings. Gunnar rode the fence line twice in a single day, checking latches he had already checked that week, the way a careful man moves when something in the air has told him to be careful. By the second week of January, the whole county understood what was coming. Not an ordinary cold snap, but something longer. The kind of system that could sit over a region for the better part of a week, dropping temperatures far below what most stoves and most woodpiles were built to outlast comfortably. Elin prepared as best she could. She had grown genuinely confident in the closed bed by then, having carried her family through nearly 2 months of steady use. But confidence and a once-in-a-generation blizzard were different things entirely. She checked every seam of the weighted curtains. She reinforced the frame where the wood had begun to loosen slightly from repeated use. She brought in extra kindling, though she now needed remarkably little of it compared to the previous winter. Her wood count, when she finally allowed herself to do the arithmetic again, had improved considerably from the frightening number she had faced in November. What remained, if the storm behaved the way most winter storms in that county behaved, looked as though it might actually last. If, 3 farms over, that same word carried very different weight. Gunnar had a larger house, a larger family, and a wood-burning habit built entirely around keeping every room warm through every hour of the night. The traditional approach, the approach nearly every household in the county still relied on. His supply was healthier than Elin's had been in November, but a storm of the size now bearing down on the territory did not care much about healthy. It cared about duration. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening, the sky lowering into a gray so uniform it seemed to erase the horizon entirely. And by nightfall the wind had begun testing every loose board and every unsealed gap across the county, the way weather like that always did, searching for whatever a house had failed to notice about itself. The blizzard held for 2 full days before it revealed which houses had been built or adapted to withstand something this size and which had not. Elin's house was tested harder than any night before it. The wind did not simply blow steadily from one direction the way it had during the earlier storm that exposed the gap near the floor. It shifted, hour by hour, working its way around the cabin from multiple angles, probing at seams the weighted curtains had handled easily under calmer conditions. On the second night, she noticed a new draft entirely. This one along the top edge of the curtain frame where it met the ceiling. A spot that had never been a problem before, because the wind had never previously come from that particular direction with that particular force. Christian, warm and mostly asleep beside her, began coughing again for the first time in weeks, a small sound that pulled Elin fully awake and searching immediately. She found the gap by touch, working her hand along the top rail until she felt the cold current confirm itself. Without hesitation, she pulled a folded blanket from the foot of the bed and wedged it into the space, pressing it firm against the wood, buying herself time rather than a permanent fix. It held. Not perfectly, but enough. Christian's breathing settled within the hour, and Elin spent the remainder of that night sitting upright beside him, one hand resting against the blanket wedged into the gap, monitoring it the way a person monitors anything they are not yet fully certain will hold. 3 farms over, the household wasn't managing nearly as well. Their stove, generously fed as always, was consuming wood at a rate the family had never needed to sustain for this many consecutive hours. By the second night, Gunnar had begun rationing what remained, aware that the storm showed no clear sign of breaking, aware that his own children were now sleeping in a house considerably colder than the one they were used to, because the fire could no longer be fed at the pace the weather demanded. He did not yet think of Elin's curtains. He was too occupied with his own arithmetic, the same arithmetic she had faced in November, only now arriving for him in the middle of the worst storm the county had seen in years. The third night was the one that mattered most, and it was the night Elin's fire went out completely, hours before dawn, with no wood remaining to feed it, and no safe way to venture out into a storm that had by then reduced visibility to almost nothing beyond the cabin walls. She discovered this near 2 in the morning, checking the stove out of habit, finding only cold ash where the coals should have been. For a moment, standing in the dark of the outer room with the wind screaming steadily against the walls, she felt the same fear that had gripped her back in November, staring at 9 cords of wood and doing math that refused to close. No fire. A blizzard still raging outside, a child sleeping in the next room. But this time, the fear did not last as long, because this time she understood something she had not understood in November. The house did not need to stay warm. Only the small space did. She returned to the closed bed, drew the curtains shut behind her, checked the blanket still wedged firmly against the ceiling gap, and settled in beside Christian, whose breathing remained slow and even, undisturbed by a fire he did not actually depend on to survive the night. She did not sleep. Not really. Not with the wind still testing the walls the way it was. But she was warm. Christian was warm, and somewhere beneath the fear, she found herself doing the math one more time. Differently this time, not counting cords of wood, but counting hours until the storm was expected to break, and realizing, almost with disbelief, that they were going to make it through without the fire at all. Dawn arrived pale and reluctant, the wind finally beginning to loosen its grip sometime after sunrise. When Aylin drew back the curtains and stepped into the outer room, the air outside the closed bed was bitterly cold, cold enough to see her breath instantly, cold enough that anyone sleeping openly in that room through the night would have been in genuine danger. She and Christian had slept through it, warm. The knock at her door came less than an hour later. It was Gunnar, hollow-eyed, asking, with none of November's careful skepticism left in his voice, whether she might have wood to spare, and whether she would be willing to explain, properly this time, exactly how those curtains of hers actually worked. By the following winter, Aylin's closed bed was no longer a curiosity whispered about in Mrs. Thorvald's kitchen. It had a name in the county, borrowed loosely from the Norwegian, and at least 6 households had built some version of it before the first snow fell, adjusting the design to their own homes the way any useful idea eventually gets adjusted once enough people have tried it. Gunnar built one for his own family within a month of that storm, though he never quite admitted, in so many words, how close his own household had come to real trouble during those 3 days. He did not need to. Everyone in that county understood the shape of that particular winter, and understood which houses had struggled and which had not. Aylin never became a wealthy woman. The farm remained modest, the winters remained long, and the ledger with her husband's handwriting still sat in the same drawer years later. Not because she needed it, but because some things earn a place regardless of whether they are still useful. What changed was smaller than wealth, and in its own way, more durable. She was no longer the widow the county quietly worried about each November. She was the woman who had figured something out, and who had shared it plainly, without asking anything in return beyond a fair hearing. Christian grew up sleeping behind those curtains every winter of his childhood, and when he built his own house years later, on his own stretch of that same prairie, the first thing he built inside it, before the second room, before the proper furniture, was a closed bed of heavy wool, sized for a wife he had not yet met, and children he did not yet have. Because he already understood something his mother had spent one long winter learning the hard way. The house did not need to be warm. Only the people inside it did. The wall of curtains that once made a widow the subject of quiet county gossip became, within a handful of winters, simply how sensible people in that region slept through the coldest months. Nobody remembered exactly when the mockery stopped. It simply stopped being mentioned, the way most mockery does once it turns out to have been wrong. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.